Good morning, everyone. A warm welcome to all of our national and international guests. My name is Tanjila Hussain Tonni. I'm a research assistant, Center for Government Studies. In today's world, AI influences how we work, communicate, trust, and even how we build relationships. That's why understanding trust in the age of AI is more important than ever. It is my honor to introduce today's session on artificial trust, loving and lying in the age of AI. We are fortunate to have 4 distinguished speakers with us today. Chung, Director, Knowledge for Development Foundation, Narayan Adhikari, Southeast Asia Lead Accountability Lab, Nepal, Aung, Accountability and Innovation Manager, Global Network Initiative, and Tanha Kate, Associate Relationship Manager, Citibank PLC. They will share their insights on technology, trust, and the future of human-AI relationship. The session will continue under the guidance of our Honorable Moderator, Chung. Thank you all for joining us. Now I would like to hand over the session to our Honorable Moderator, Chung. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this panel of artificial trust, living, loving, and lying in the age of AI. When we were preparing for this panel, we thought, my goodness, what a broad topic, an absolutely broad topic of artificial intelligence, and how do we frame artificial trust in this context of the world that we're living in at the moment. And so I have with me 3 different varied perspectives from sectoral representation. And I would love to start by asking and inviting all of them to define what they see as artificial trust in their context. And then we'll just moderate the session as a discussion as we go along. Please feel free to, if you have questions, and to hold those, and we'll try and leave some space for some questions at the moment. So why don't we start with you, Min?
Hi, everyone. My name is Min. I work for the Global Network Initiative. So we are a US-based multi-stakeholder initiative comprised of companies, academia, civil society, and investors. And what we do is that we essentially provide guidance on how companies should respond when they receive government interventions broadly that impact freedom of expression and privacy rights. So my interpretation, just to answer your question, Pyrou, about trust is very much from that perspective, right? So, I guess the 2 actors, shall we say, that within my organization's remit are obviously companies in the first instance, in the AI context, and also governments, right? So I would reinterpret the question as how companies, how governments increase, maintain the trust of rights holders or end users of AI products and services within their, I guess, activities in AI, right? So if we start to look at, I won't give the full kind of overview, just to give my other panelists some time as well. But if we look at governments, for example, what do governments need to do in relation to AI to increase, to maintain the trust of their populations, right? So is it about, having laws and regulations that respect human rights, that have human rights at their core? Is it about implementing these laws? Is it about providing remedy when, when rights have been violated? And similar kind of dimension for companies as well. So that's the kind of angle that I will be talking through today. Thank you so much. Over to you.
Oh, I think what you highlight in your work is the responsibility of whose responsibility is it to build that trust. And it's interesting that a lot of that is vested in and governments and corporations. But Nara, you work with civil society, and it would be lovely to get your perspective on what the civil society actors have in terms of their role in building artificial trust.
Thank you. I think this mic needs to be fixed. That's where we can start building our trust. Okay, thank you, Pyrou, and thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming to this session. My name is Narayan. I'm from Nepal, and I run an organization called the Accountability Lab. When you hear the term accountability, the accountability happens when there is a trust, and when there is a real trust, right? So to understand how this artificial trust works, we need to understand how the real trust works, right? How the nature, the law of trust, how the law of natural trust works. I think for me, in a funny way, it's a kind of a cozy blanket of relationship. You use it if you feel it that this is not actually acting against you, right? When it comes about democracy, civil society, civic engagement, making sure that everyone has a voice, everyone has an opportunity, everyone has equal say on how they want to save their society. If there is a way that we can build that people feel owned and based on what they trust, is going to work for them. In terms of voice, accountability, building a system of governance and democracy. So I think trust is very much of a manipulated these days when you talk about artificial intelligence or use of technology. If the real trust are engineered based on bias, manipulation by the technology, because a lot of this technology have imported from where our context does not necessarily, resemble. So once you have this technology using for your context, bringing from the context where they don't necessarily understand your language, your values, your real, how you define your trust, how you define your accountability, how you define your social connections, the gatherings, and the aspiration of the collective moments, never been resembled on how the current technologies, for example, artificial intelligence, have built. Although there's hundreds of benefits that we can harness, but again, so there is a challenge of bias and there's a manipulation. That's where the problem begins when we talk about artificial trust. Overleading the real trust.
Back and forth with the mic. Kate, from your perspective as a corporate financing, we've got government perspectives, we've got human rights perspective, and as a corporation using artificial intelligence, how do you see building trust within those within your context?
Thank you. So my name is Kate. I'm with Citibank PLC, where I work in corporate banking. I serve clients both local and foreign across the power, infrastructure, and manufacturing sectors. And the questions that Narayan just highlighted are very much pertinent to the banking sector as it is today. In Bangladesh, the banking sector is has almost been crippled by a crisis. Bangladesh, in the entire Asian region, has the highest rates of loan defaults. It stands at 20% officially, but we expect the number to be much higher unofficially. And the cause for these loan defaults are human. They're human because of political lending that took place under the last regime. They're human because of licenses for banks being given out willy-nilly without the corporate governance controls being in place. And all of these factors together have contributed to essentially a crisis in banking and a crisis of trust towards banking. And where I see artificial intelligence coming into the picture is as a solution to many of these challenges. Because of course there are questions around accountability, interpretability, integrity, and other model features that come with any application of AI. But the fundamental feature that AI allows is traceability. AI models, when implemented properly, have an intrinsic feature of being traceable in ways that unofficial transactions, unofficial agreements cannot be. And I see transparency as the backdrop on which accountability is built. And through that dimension, I see AI playing an important role in rebuilding trust in the banking sector and in strengthening corporate governance across the private sector as a whole.
I think you mentioned two relevant key points here that I think we should open up and unpack. And the first one is that AI is hugely invested in. The AI industry is led by a handful of corporations. Most of those corporations are registered in the United States. There's about 7 of them. And they're holding up about 40% of the growth of AI globally. And that's a real concern in terms of power dynamics and shifts, right? So when the artificial intelligence we're using is not in control, we're not in control in terms of the governing structures of how they're executed and delivered and implemented and utilized. So that these systems are touted to solve real human problems. And yet, what has artificial intelligence actually solved? What is the contribution that it's made to the globe in terms of real case studies, especially in this context of Asia? And then the second issue that you raised that I think is worth unpacking is surveillance. So the absolute traceability and implications of our digital footprint being eternal within these systems that are controlled externally to us in terms of our person and our governments. And that's that risk of surveillance. And so I wanted to maybe start with the first question on what problems is artificial intelligence solving? And is there solid proof that we're actually making progress?
I'm happy to start, just because it's building off of what I just said. So I think I'll start from Bangladesh and maybe zoom out from then on if needed. In the Bangladeshi banking sector, we see AI as a game changer. We see AI as a game changer for 2 reasons. AI's application within the banking sector can be either customer-facing or it can be back office facing, and both have strong implications for trust. So let me start with the first. When it comes to customer facing applications, what we've seen is that the use of AI as a risk assessment tool, a credit risk assessment tool, has been phenomenal. What's happened is, in partnership with bKash, which is the largest mobile financial services operator in Bangladesh, Citibank has launched a digital credit service, which essentially takes data from behavioral and transactional sources and extends credit, mostly small ticket sizes. So we're talking like $50 to $300. And the uptake in the digital nano loan has been quite impressive from the banking sector's perspective. For instance, we see a 40% uptake in women. In conventional lending, that number is at just 15%. On top of that, when we look at rural and urban divides, in the rural sector, in conventional banking, it's only 5%, and 95% goes to urban customers. But in the nano loans experience, we've seen that the divide is actually 60-40. So 60% goes to urban and 40% goes to rural. And what this allows is, both from a business perspective, the solution to scale at cost, because underwriting costs are high. No bank would go for extending loans of $50 for a process that costs $80 to $100 for the actual mechanics to take place. So from that angle, we've seen, and the customer-facing end, AI as being a game changer in terms of the impact it has on people's lives. In the back end, in the back office sector, we also see very strong applications for AI, particularly in anti-money laundering and terrorist financing prevention, because AI is dynamic. It takes real-time data and it analyzes it and has a proactive approach to signaling which transactions might be fraudulent, which might be associated with money laundering, terrorist financing. And that is an area that we're just starting to explore, and we see a lot of opportunity in terms of strengthening trust. Because if you can't think of the financial system as fair, as efficient, as free of malicious actors, you cannot trust the financial system. You cannot trust AI.
Kate, what you mentioned, I truly agree. And I think that's some of the things also happening in Nepal when it comes about creating access to finance to people through banking and other non-banking financial institutions. So, however, the challenge still remains is the access to people who are beyond the technological, opportunity. That is that. But there are a few areas I have also seen growing enormously when it comes about civic movement. So one is, for example, Nepal recently had this Gen Z protest. And everything is changed. Now regime change, we have this political transition, the vacuum. The institutions are not really functioning, although they are in a moment of silence, they have gone in a dormant situation because this is a transitional government. And the government is now very much focused into election, maintaining rule of law, and making sure there is a smooth flow of at least basic, the civil services. While the government is focusing on just a few things, which are very, very important, based on priority of the transition, there are other institutions are just sitting, waiting and seeing. So as a citizen, as an activist, as a researcher, or as an entrepreneur, a business person, you are actually lacking enough data, enough information, enough insights. I think here AI have filled the gap. So you can get a lot of, if you are not getting a real time or the domestic data, but you are still get some access, at least a secondary government for you, or a source where you get information, ideas, as a source for you to think, to innovate and practice. That in that sense, I think it is still useful. And then in terms of the, you mentioned about money laundering and tracing corruptions. So people are using, especially that, coming with a lot of good civic tech ideas, including there is one called Speak Up Nepal, where they crowdsource, information around how people are affected because of the corruptions, bureaucracy, and bad governance, and they crowdsource all this information, and they also, engage people collectively, as well as the individually, to appeal and to file the petition through online. And they crowdsource, they analyze, interpret all of this information through AI. In that sense, it's very, very useful. And it's also not that expensive from that civic movement perspectives. Likewise, there's a lot of fake news, deepfakes that we have experienced during the Gen Z protest. And it is usually a common phenomena when you have technology and massive flow of information. You also counter with misinformation, disinformation, defamation, because there are people, there are groups. They always try to discredit and manipulate the real facts. So again, to counter these narratives, to counter these deepfakes, you need some sort of technology. You need information. So AI is still helping on that too. But the question remains, is do we have enough capacity and the tools and understanding of how we use on the basis of our own organic needs? So that's where the gap is. However, the opportunity is there. People slowly trying to leverage it. One last thing, and then I'll pass it to you. So in Nepal recently, especially around fintech, digital payment, and bringing those people from marginalized communities who never had access to finance, the financial literacy was very low, access wasn't there. But with the digital payment using QR codes for payments, receivings, bringing people into this, stock market has been always a challenge for Nepal. It's remote, not connected, not accessible for everyone. But only people who are in the cities were getting these benefits. Now with the use of various tools, technologies, particularly adopted by the fintech companies, the mutual funds, the capitals, financial institutions have helped to get more access to the people who are on the margins. So in that sense, it's very useful.
Yeah, I mean, if I could just briefly touch upon a key point that you made, are we making progress, right, around how AI is used or potentially misused around the world? So I would like to take this, I guess, my intervention, one step abstracted away from specific country situations and just look at broadly sort of 3 different ways that AI is being regulated around the world, right? Because that's kind of tied part and parcel with where the progress is being made, right? And I guess it also depends on how you define progress, right? But in any case, 3 broad models, or I guess the very kind of, more recently, innovation-focused model of regulation that is being championed by some parts within the US administration, shall we say. Second model is the EU's kind of very much safety first, risk management type approach. And the third, we're maybe a bit closer to home, is more of a kind of a control-based authoritarian, one could say China-led kind of model. And when you ask the question, is progress being made? Well, I guess depends, how you define progress, coming back to that, right? If you define progress as, we've got to be the world leader in AI at all costs, right? Then progress will be defined according to the American model, I would imagine. If we define progress in terms of, well, are we protecting human rights? Are we protecting the rights holders and potential other users of AI? Then one would argue progress is being made to the European model of regulation, where you have the EU AI Act that prohibits certain use cases, that defines, high-risk use cases for AI that require specific prevention and mitigation measures. I could go on, but I'll keep it brief. But if you define progress in terms of, specific ideologies or specific political parties, one could say, maintaining control and power of AI, then another model might fit that kind of paradigm, as it were, right? So it depends how you define progress, but yeah, happy to explore later. Thank you.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and thank you for bringing up the 3 different models, because we're in Asia, and we're in this context, and so it would be really interesting to understand also. I have my own personal opinions about that progress in Asia, having worked mainly in Southeast Asia, where I've seen the influence of Chinese investments increase throughout the region, and the dependence on Chinese financing now in the absence of also ODA from Western, traditional Western donors such as USAID and the European Union. And so how do you see that roadmap play out in the context of Asian nations here, where there is heavy diversity, I guess, in governments, but also a lot of mistrust in governments as well, right? Are we pushing towards a techno-optimistic solution for something that isn't a technical solution? It doesn't need a technical solution. It's a human problem, right, of corruption and antitrust in our governments. Thoughts?
Thank you for the question. I would love to go back to a point that you raised earlier, Pyrou, which was around the concentration within the AI industry. So across the AI lifecycle, from the hardware to the AI models, the training data to the applications we use, we see huge concentration. And just to illustrate, NVIDIA, which is the world's largest supplier of computer chips that power AI models, claims a market share of 90%. which is massive. And we see similar levels of concentration across the AI lifecycle, and we also see vertical integration across these different stages. For example, OpenAI's partnership with Microsoft involved OpenAI choosing to use Microsoft's cloud computing resources. So we see an incredible amount of concentration. Now, concentration by itself does not raise alarm, but I think there is an important need to actively monitor what's happening, whether there are any uncompetitive practices, unethical practices happening as a result of that market structure. And I think that governments need to invest in that across the board, whether in Asia or beyond. And on top of that, because you mentioned about governance challenges in general and our relationships to governments, I think AI gives us an opportunity to address governance in a way that's different from how it's been usually done in Asia, especially in Bangladesh. Governance has always been very top-down. The rules get made on the top and then they trickle down to the bottom, and implementation and policy are miles apart. But AI, by the virtue of being an innovative technology, by the virtue of being something new, requires governments to be more nimble, to take feedback from the participants and citizens and different stakeholders in how they interact with the AI systems. And it forces a level of decentralization that if we are serious about AI regulation and AI governance, we have to adopt. And I think that presents an opportunity once again regarding how governance relationships can be refashioned in the subcontinent and within the larger world.
Now, would you like to speak to this?
I don't have to add many things, but the only thing is that I agree with you. The government, although seeing enormous opportunity harnessing technology, AI, but the government have, like the previous government, have seen this as an opportunity for them to continue their authoritarian power. For that reasons, they come up with regressive policies. For example, we had these AI policies, not really promoting innovation, not really promoting transparency, accountability, or flattening governance, rather finding a way to contain regulation, surveillance, right? So they knew that these technologies, AI is going to, going to counter them, going to question their power of the information access to the common people. Then they were already so smart than the AI, so they come up with all these regressive policies, right? I would say personally, thanks that the protest happened, the parliament dissolved, so this is still pending, and I believe that this law will be evaluated again. But then, like the policies that the government comes with on regulating is actually not towards that line. That's where the challenge is. So. In one and then this is based on not always the domestic interest. Yeah. It is geopolitics. It is a part of the internationalizations of democracy or aid. So I think the policy hurdles towards the advancements of the technology is another things that we have experienced. But let's see how we can bring that citizen-centric, people-driven, based on real, need to harness technology, for example, for the growth and progress.
No, I think you're right that there is a huge concentration in terms of the value chain of artificial intelligence that's creating a power asymmetry, right? Where the power lies within these big corporations. And governments in this region are capturing that. So there is a huge amount of elite capture. And I wonder, Min, in your work, how do you sort of mediate these conflicts of interest between the corporations and governments?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I guess I would like to briefly touch upon a point that you mentioned around, I guess, trust of populations of their governments, as well as, mediation in the relationship between governments and corporations. So there's two separate answers, I guess, I would like to briefly give. So the first is, you're quite right to say that, there is varying levels of trust, shall we say, within Asian countries towards their governments, right? And of course, exacerbating that is, for example, the adoption of AI technologies or even non-AI technologies that aim to, shall we say, maintain, control of the population, for want of a better word. And I don't even want to mention my own home country of Myanmar, but even broader, there is, adoption of technologies from some regional technologically advanced countries, shall we say, that may have impacts on both freedom of expression and privacy rights. And in the context of that, building trust, I think, in that kind of context might be challenging, but at the same time, we believe that, like human rights are universal, right? And this contradiction, or at least view that, innovation and human rights cannot be achieved hand in hand, is, I think, a very limited view. We do believe that it is possible to have innovative technologies, specifically innovation in AI, while respecting rights. It just requires, the willingness of actors to pursue that approach, which obviously does raise questions around, within populations, of course, around, their own, political leadership, shall we say. So that's one point. Now, coming back to your direct question around mediation between governments and companies. So essentially, our work at GNI comprises of, 4 broad areas of work. Two of them are relevant to the work that you mentioned. So one of which is policy advocacy, and the second is the area that I directly look after, which is accountability. Within the policy piece, what we try and do as GNI is to ensure that human rights are at the heart of any government interventions in technology, generally, including AI, right? So whether it is, governments proposing or enacting new AI laws that impact freedom of expression or privacy rights, we get involved as a membership organization, as a multi-stakeholder, initiative, in providing comments, providing statements of concern, providing recommendations on these sorts of issues. And one example I would love to kind of point out is the work that we've recently published just last month around how governments intervene in AI across the world, right? And recommendations for governments, recommendations for companies, and recommendations for civil society to ensure that those kind of interventions protect and respect and remedy rights impacts, for the foreseeable future, right? So that's one area of work that we do. But on the accountability side, right? So again, GNI exists to help companies work through government interventions that impact rights, right? So if a company, is faced with a law that requires, for example, handing over user data to the government for national security purposes, if companies are forced to surveil their customers, if companies are forced to censor information, what should companies be doing in these kind of situations to respect rights? And it's not an easy situation, right? On the one hand, you have governments requiring companies to, situate employees within their jurisdiction, so that it's providing having local offices which provide, some degree of leverage to ensure compliance. There's a risk to employees, but at the other hand, there's a risk to, rights holders. Employees being rights holders themselves, but non-employee rights holders if companies follow government orders and interventions without questioning, right? So, the GNI principles basically talk about how international human rights law should be applied in those kind of contexts, and I think that's one way that we try and mediate between the two.
It's really, the human rights angle is really interesting to me, because fundamentally we're having this discussion about integrating human rights into technology to a sector that is not necessarily invested in human rights in the forefront, right? That's not their primary purpose and objective. Artificial intelligence and most technology corporations have a mandate to make money. And so it's not at the forefront of their business model or innovation model for a start. So is it necessarily then having the monopoly and concentration within these corporations who don't have this within their mandate or values, isn't it then a question of, are they stifling then innovations that would invent and create technologies that would place human rights at the forefront? I mean, when we think about the value chains and the entire cost of artificial intelligence, it's challenging to think of alternative solutions because it is expensive to design and develop artificial intelligence. But where are the opportunities then to create alternative technologies that are vested in decentralized approaches that would empower citizens of all sectors to be protected? Are there any examples in your line of work that you've seen?
So if you have the system of governance that is based on values, ethics, human rights, and the country or the society put the human rights as the first, as one of the most priority areas, then you later on think of how do you harness these technology, whether this technology is going to accelerate your human rights or it will curtail your human rights. Then it comes a question of what kind of policy we design, what kind of technology we harness, and how do we integrate into our local context, the dynamics, and then use those tools that are friendly to people based on, let's say, a simple example like how can you introduce a technology that the digital literacy is none or very, very minimum? Then you are creating a unequal, you are discriminating them, right? So a lot of governments in paper, they even sign the human rights declarations, international human rights declaration, UN, they have their local policies, but they are not following through is because it's so politicized, it's so political, and it's so costly, as you say, and they are not sure harnessing this technology, whether it's in business or governance, bureaucracy or civic movements, will actually ensure human rights of an individual that gives individual a power, dignity, respects, right? Or it will question their status quo. So if these things plays as a major role in terms of so-called political governance, political economy, then the problems becomes very, very difficult. However, there are groups, if you go at the hyper local level, the women groups, for example, the indigenous communities, are uniting, building that collective aspiration, the voice, and working on brainstorming themselves how they can leverage their own power of convening the local knowledge, those assets, as a means to shift the power. And then maybe they are not aware of this, the sophisticated artificial intelligence, all that algorithms and computing and those things. But they know how to use social media at least, right? And they are in the social media. For them, the social media is like a bread and butter or a tea. But still, the social media is been manipulated, is been powered, is been designed by a system that these people they never have an access. So if you see from that perspective, from the positive perspective, how they leverage social media to build their social connection and the power, and I still see amazing. But there is a risk of surveillance or attack, manipulation, and manipulated by the artificial intelligence in terms of what they like, what they dislike, what their frustration are, what their anxieties are. I think that's where the commerce involved, that's where the money involved. So that ecosystem is not understood yet when it comes about bringing that real human rights into individuals and collectively.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. I work with indigenous populations across Southeast Asia, that are very unaware of the embedded surveillance within technology, and I think that's a real problem across, I guess, across the globe, probably. But I wanted to pause just for a moment to see if there were any questions from the audience, because I know that we started a little bit late, so I'm not sure if we can go a little bit longer. Are there any questions?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Shiva, and I'm a second secretary in the Indian High Commission in Dhaka. And first of all, thank you so much. The discourse was very informative. I have a question for Mr. Min. So you talked about these authoritarian models of AI innovation and progress. So my question is, what are the mechanisms for such authoritarian models in certain countries to diffuse out into developing economies? Is it possible? I'm pretty sure it happens. So I just wanted to understand what are the mechanisms and what are the implications of such diffusions of models.
That's a very loaded topic. I'll try and give a diplomatic answer to, a diplomat as well, I guess. I mean, let's just put it this way. When we look at, whether you look at models of governance or actual AI models that follow these models of governance, right? There's always, almost like, the buffet we have downstairs, right? Like there's a smorgasbord of options in terms of, whether you want, European style, very kind of, highly regulated, shall we say, models that follow quite well prescribed, I guess using the EU term, fundamental human rights. At the other end of the spectrum, you do have, I guess, models that surprisingly do respect some human rights, right? Like the right to privacy, for example, is actually still quite prominent in some models of governance, and also AI models that follow that, that type of governance. But of course, that do fall short in other areas of human rights protections, right? So what are the incentives for developing countries to adopt these kind of models? Well, I guess it's a tricky one to answer. I think, most of us in the room, I think, may already have the answer to part of that question. But what we would say, though, is that, wherever you are in the world, right, human rights are universal, right? Like, and coming back to the topic of this panel, trust, right? The ultimate way a government can build trust is not just to provide economic development, which is obviously a very important part of building trust in a government, right? But that only goes so far, right? Once a population gets to a certain level of economic development, then they look at, I guess, coming back to the, is it Maslow's hierarchy of needs? Once you get past a certain stage, other kind of opportunities for development come into play beyond economic development, right? And it is at that point when governments will need to do something different to build trust, to maintain trust. And that is where, at least, we would argue that, respect for universal human rights within AI governance models and within the models themselves is what will maintain that trust going forward. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I want to reiterate what you said in that people create governance structures. Literally, government officials are people. So we, the people, create these governing structures, and artificial intelligence is not artificial, it's created. And we mustn't forget the linkages between the persons who are behind the creation of those technologies, right? So we have the power to influence both those sectors. Please.
Morning. Thank you. My name is Anas from EPD. I have one quick follow-up questions. What kind of AI governance models that work across countries? Because, that's the realities of AI now. And then we saw what's happened with the DSA in Europe, that they hard to basically take the platforms to be accountable because they just don't think that they have obligations on that. Thank you.
So, full disclaimer, I am not a governance specialist, but I'll take a stab at the question because I think that an important element of the answer has to be localization. So localization cuts across the AI life cycle. It starts from using data of the location that one is based in to implement AI in ways that are beneficial to the local population, so that's one. Secondly, it also involves local model development, so developing models that actually help the location that we are considering. If we think about Bangladesh in specific, we are in a developing country, and usually for development, economic theory states that you need a lot of innovation in order to learn and understand what sort of solutions will work for you. Solutions that have worked elsewhere may not necessarily work for us over here. And that's a very expensive and time-consuming process. And when AI is able to be integrated to kind of short-circuit that process and do it faster and quicker, that helps with our development trajectory. So that's why the model development should also be location-specific. And another area that I'm really passionate about, and I've been interviewing data centers in Bangladesh nationally, is about having data centers that are locally based, because otherwise our data is being subject to foreign jurisdictions and foreign laws. So we do not have the fundamental control and data sovereignty that we want. So if a country in which we have our data centers, or from which we're drawing data center resources, for any reason closes down, then that cuts off computing access for the rest of our population, and that creates a dramatic inequity. So I think that localization has to be part of the governance solution to these problems.
This reminds you of our conversation yesterday, so you probably know what I'm going to say. So agree that having a local, I guess, spin on whether it comes to the AI infrastructure, whether it comes to AI models, whether it comes to AI deployments of these models, right, is no doubt important, reflecting differences in language, differences in culture, etc. Right? Agree. However, there is a but. If we find ourselves in a particular, and I'm not saying this about any specific country, but if we did find ourselves in a hypothetical country, right, which believes, in social scoring, in monitoring populations, in, I could go on. One could argue that the models that are built in that environment are also localized, right? But does it respect universal human rights? That's a question, right? So what we would argue is that embedding international human rights considerations within, for example, international AI governance models. So coming back to our colleague from the Indian High Commission, right? In February next year, there's the India AI Summit, right? And we are taking part as GNI actively with our partners in that event to make sure that international AI governance models, which are evolving as we speak, there's no single international standard right now, but there hopefully will be in future. And if that embeds international human rights principles, then that actually allows human rights to be respected protected hopefully in regulations across the world, while not taking away the importance of customizing models to each population's unique needs. So how do we find that balance to ensure that at a very bare minimum, right, international human rights protections are embedded in AI regulations around the world?
There's a very interesting nexus between localization and actually the principles of human rights, because human rights are applied differently across the board. And I've been told to wrap up the session. So this has been an amazing discussion with some amazing thoughts and thought leaders here at the table. So I really appreciate all of your thoughts. Just to wrap up, that I think that this discussion is ongoing, and I think we're just seeing the start of the AI boom now. And I want to leave everyone here with the thought that trust is built, trust is created, right? We need to be proactive in how we're shaping the industry and the sector. And so I hope that you've taken some thoughts and ideas from the panelists today, and in your context and your work setting can implement some of these actions to build trust in the AI sector. So thank you very much.
Hello. Thanks to all our speakers for their valuable moment and all of their audience.